My name is Gennifer Choldenko, and I write books for kids and young adults. Some of the titles that you may recognize are Al Capone Does My Shirts, Al Capone Shines My Shoes, and No Passengers Beyond This Point. So some of the books that really made a big impression in my life were Harriet the Spy by Louise Fitzhugh. All of the Oz books I loved. I loved A Wrinkle in Time and Island of the Blue Dolphins. I loved, what else? Anything by Roald Dahl. I think that Roald Dahl influenced me in many ways. I loved the Narnia books, and my older sister used to read to me every night, and I'm in debt to her for that because I think she helped make the books come alive for me. Not surprisingly, I love to read kids' books, and I'm very excited every year when the Newbery is announced because I get to read a new crop of books. I always try and read the ones that I think might win the Newbery ahead of time because even as a kid I loved that seal, and I looked for books like Across 5 Aprils that had that seal. And so I love quality books. I like reading adult books too, but I usually read the kids' books first. My siblings were very, and are, very important to me. I feel like in many ways my older sister and my older brother raised me more than my parents did. And I'm sure that's not really true, but that's the way it feels, and I'm really close to them. So, because there were 4 kids in their family, and we have 2 cousins that were kind of like siblings, it was like 6 siblings, and we were just such a pack. So I was very interested in that time, and those relationships really inform my work. I think the family dynamics in No Passengers Beyond This Point is the closest to the family dynamics in my family. I'm not exactly like Mouse, and my oldest sister is not exactly like India, and my brother's not exactly like Finn, but the exchanges between them seem really familiar. And the ages that we were really reflect the age separation that we have. And I had an invisible friend whose name was Bing, so that part is really true. And in writing Mouse, I remembered how much I loved Bing. It was really interesting. And I think in some ways that I segued from an imaginary friend to having characters. So there was a real connection for me. I always had great teachers. I know some writers tell these stories about how they were discouraged by their teachers. That isn't my case at all. I remember Mrs. Rosenthal in 5th grade was so encouraging of my writing. She really made me believe that I had talent and ability. And I loved hearing the recommendations. I always loved English. I loved I know you call it language arts now, but we used to call them English teachers, and I loved every English teacher I had. I remember Mrs. Gangsey, Sharon Brokey. They were really helpful to me, and I looked forward to English class. My 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Rosenthal, had meant really a lot to me. So when I got to college, I decided I needed to go and find her and tell her how much she had meant to me. And when I went back, she didn't remember me at all. I could tell. She tried, but I was just a complete blank. And at first, of course, that hurt my feelings because everybody wants to be that special student that a teacher remembers their whole life. But after a while, I began to see that there had been a lot of kids that Mrs. Rosenthal had helped. Many, many of them. And the fact that she didn't remember me just said, how powerful she was in so many kids' lives. I think sometimes teachers don't realize the impact that they have. I know my daughter's teacher, whatever he says, she does. I mean, he has such power in her life. And I think that the role of a teacher is so undervalued in our society. I really do. I think we are all here because we had good teachers. I write for kids because I naturally write as a 12-year-old. That's just the way it comes out. I don't try and write for kids. Some part of me never really turned 13. And so I just so easily relate to the world as a 12-year-old. You know, there's a downside to that my husband will explain to you at some point, that he's married to a 12-year-old. But I love writing for kids, and people ask, are you ever going to write an adult novel? And I always say, I have no interest in it. I think adult life is boring. A lot of people think that I consciously make decisions to have humor in my work or to speak as if I'm 12, but both those things are really just a part of who I am. My voice comes through humorously. It doesn't when I'm just speaking, but when I'm writing, I have a distance from people, and my true self really comes out in a way that I can't in normal life. And my true self has this kind of sarcastic, humorous tone. So I am just naturally who I am, and luckily that is something that kids respond to. Ideas come to me in all kinds of ways. I never can predict how they'll come, and that's what makes it kind of fun. I get lots of ideas, and the one that I end up pursuing is the one that drives me crazy, that won't let me be. Because intellectually I'll think, well, is this idea the right idea is this going to work, is that going to work? But it turns out that all that intellectualizing really just gets in my way, because the one that I end up doing is the one that I can't not do. I describe it sometimes as it's like the fly that buzzes around me and drives me nuts until I follow the fly to the book. But sometimes I get ideas for the Al Capone books. I got the idea from an article in the newspaper. For No Passengers, I just had the desire to write a fantasy, and for years actually. And I would get all these ideas, and I didn't really like the idea. And what happened with No Passengers is I just started writing, and I didn't know where I was going. And so that's a real unusual way. I've never had a book come to me quite like that. Well, I'm a mom. I have a 16-year-old and an 11-year-old, so my day starts with me taking them to school. And then when I get home, I walk by the dirty laundry and the dirty dishes and the messy house and walk straight to my office, because I would much rather write than do housework. And I hope that I don't have too much marketing work, that I can just unplug the internet and spend the time with my work, because that is so much fun. That's the best thing I can do any day, is to spend time with my work. I don't do page counts. I know a lot of authors require that of themselves, that they do a couple of pages every day. I don't like to do that, because then I rush through it. And sometimes the best writing day will be reconfiguring what I have rather than moving forward. And if I force myself to move forward prematurely, then I won't, the quality of the work suffers. I do not think about anyone but myself when I write. I write for myself. A good day at the keyboard, I make myself laugh and I make myself cry. Well, for me, the process of getting published was different than I've heard other writers talk about, because I didn't have trouble getting my first book published. I sent it to the first publisher. They wanted me to make some changes that I didn't want to make, so I sent it to the second publisher and they bought it. Really unusual. But the universe got back at me when it was time to get a second book published, because I had about 53 second books. Even though the first picture book had done well, I could not get a second book published to save my soul. And 7 years went by from the time that the first book was accepted for publication and the time the second book was accepted for publication. In retrospect, I see that I really am a novelist, and I was learning my craft, and that period was my apprenticeship. But at the time, it just looked like I was never going to be able to do this. And in fact, I had a friend at the time who said to me, you love to write, don't send your work out, because that's where the pain is coming from. You enjoy the process, just enjoy the process and let it go. But luckily for me, I have a very hard head, and I wasn't going to give up. And I'm really happy that I didn't, because I wouldn't be sitting here if I had. Well, the best fan letter I ever got went like this. I was going to write to Roald Dahl, but he was dead, so I had to write to you instead. I love that. But it's really, to me, the most exciting thing is when I get a letter from a kid and they didn't like to read. And then they read Al Capone Does My Shirts, and it was the first book that really interested them. To me, that, one letter like that is worth my whole lifetime. For If a Tree Falls at Lunch Period, I went to the local middle school and I got permission to hang out in their library and listen. So I spent a lot of time listening. One of the characters actually came out of me seeing this girl walking down the hall headed for a talent show competition. And she was so sure of herself and singing. And I thought, how can anyone who is headed for a talent show be that sure of themselves? And that was the beginning of Brianna. I think that every child has to deal with bullying in some form or another. That's unfortunately part of the growing up process. And it is a fascinating part for me. I had a really vivid bullying experience in 7th grade, and I never forgot it. So I think that really informed If a Tree Falls at Lunch Period. I'm a bit of a news junkie, so I like to know what's happening. It's absolutely true, but I don't try to intentionally put something in because I've heard it in the news. In the case of the foreclosure for No Passengers Beyond This Point, I didn't lose my house, but my husband has his own business, and it started to have trouble when the economy had the downturn, and we really looked seriously about selling our house. And I love my house, so I think that the thought of losing a house was really in my head. Also, I heard an NPR report about the people that went in to clean out the house after it was foreclosed. And it was really an amazing NPR report, and he talked about how people would leave all their things out there in the house because they were so upset about having to leave. And so I thought, I started to visualize that. What would it be like if you were a kid and you left half your stuff in the house because there wasn't time to clean it out? And you didn't have the money to find the trailer. I mean, if you're foreclosing on your house, there's a lot of economic stresses on you. So I began to think about what would that be like. And that was when I was putting together No Passengers, so it all sort of came together. Well, with the Al Capone books, the research so completely fed the process. I mean, the truth is so much weirder than any fiction I could possibly come up with. I mean, just the title, Al Capone Does My Shirts, came from research, because it turns out if you were a kid living on Alcatraz because your father was a guard there, your laundry was done by the convicts. And Al Capone's first job on Alcatraz was in the laundry. So that phrase, Al Capone Does My Shirts, was accurate for some of the kids who lived on the island. And there was also an exchange via the laundry. So the guards that were most hated by the convicts did not send their clothes through the laundry because they knew it would come back mangled. Too much starch, cuffs sewn together, not enough buttons, etc., because the convicts were making a statement about that guard. And so that fed me all kinds of ideas. The research for the book in every way was helpful in every chapter. There's one chapter in the first book, Al Capone Does My Shirts, about what happened when Al Capone's mom came to visit. And that is what happened to her. And I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read the book, but that's something that I literally picked up the true anecdote, and then I wove the fiction around it. Well, that was a fascinating and educational process for me, trying to understand what was accurate, because there were so many myths about Alcatraz. And so one of my rules was 2 sources for something. But in some ways, that isn't really even good enough, So you could say, well, if you actually could talk to someone who was there, who I did. I am an honorary member of the Alcatraz Alumni Association. And so I know on a first name basis people who were guards there, who were convicts there, who were kids growing up there. And so when I had a question, I could actually ask them. So that was just an amazing thing. But people's memories are not always accurate. So I would even verify when you hear something with someone else whose memory might be a little better and some written sources. But as one man who grew up on the island said to me, it's the people that write the books that become the authorities, and that may not even necessarily be true. So that was eye-opening for me. Well, the very first novel I ever wrote, which thank goodness was never published, was a fantasy. So I think I've always wanted to write fantasies. Books like The Phantom Tollbooth had been really important to me when I was a kid. And I love middle grade, especially fantasy. Once fantasy gets into adult fantasy, I'm not so interested in. Somehow middle grade fantasy, I have such a connection for. So I always wanted to write fantasy, but I would come up with these ideas and I didn't really like them and they didn't really go anywhere. And so every year or two I would look at this issue again and then it wouldn't go anywhere. But what happened with No Passengers is I started to write in Mouse's voice, the youngest daughter's voice. And I wrote a realistic novel completely for like a chapter book, younger than I normally do, in her voice. And I loved the characters, but the plot was kind of boring, and my editor really didn't like it, and she usually likes my work. So I put it away for about 6 months, and then I was in between projects, and I brought it out again, and I thought, I am not leaving these characters in the file drawer. I just love them. And maybe they weren't coming across on the page enough, but I knew them inside that I could bring them out more. So I thought, well, maybe this is the time to try a fantasy. But I didn't really have an idea for the fantasy. That was the strange part. So I just thought, well, I'm going to close the door in my office, and I'm going to take what I like from this novel that I had started, and then I'm going to go from there. So I took the few chapters that I liked, and I thought, well, I'll just write the next chapter and see what happens, as if it were a fantasy. So I wrote the next chapter, and then I wrote the next chapter, and then pretty soon I was ignoring all my emails. I ignored everything. I just kept writing because it was so exciting. I couldn't wait to see what happened. And at some point I started to realize what I was doing, but I didn't initially even understand what I was writing. So when you read it, you think that I had it all figured out before I started, but I didn't. I think that fantasy is very challenging because there are no givens. If you're in a fantasy world, then you don't know how people communicate. You don't know the words necessarily they use, or if they write on a piece of paper, you have to rethink everything if you really do it well. And so it requires a huge amount of imagination. And so that, I think, once after trying the first novel that was fantasy, then I did a realistic, and the realistic was like, oh my gosh, it's like so easy compared to fantasy. But I think I wasn't quite ready to write it, and I built my skills as an author to the point where I was ready to take on a fantasy. I have a big connection to dogs, and I think that will be clear if you read the book. I really love them. I think they are amazing in understanding you, and I think that my dog always helps me through things. And at our house, whoever is upset gets the dog, and the dog goes in their room, and it really is helpful because dogs, they don't care what you did. They don't care what grade you got, what kind of review you got. They don't care. They just love you. And so that has like a real primal effect on people, I think. Right now, I've just finished an early draft of the third book in the trilogy, in the Al Capone trilogy. I'm not prepared yet. It's top secret what the title is. But I will tell you this one anecdote which comes from the book. And it isn't exactly in the book, but one of the characters that I'm describing is in the book. There was a character on Alcatraz, a convict, called the Count Lustig. And he was an amazing con man. And one of the things that he did to get his reputation was he sold the Eiffel Tower as scrap metal. He sold it actually twice as scrap metal. He saw that the French government was considering taking it down, and he made up fake letterhead as if he were a French government official, and he sent it out to all the scrap metal companies. He rented a hotel suite, And he gave a presentation to all of them and accepted their bids for the Eiffel Tower as scrap metal. And he then took the best bid and took the money and ran. So he is quite a character, and he is going to make an appearance. Actually, to finish that story, the scrap metal company that fell for the con, the guy was so embarrassed about it that he did not report the count. So of course the count did the whole scam all over again with another group of scrap metal companies. But he's very colorful, so he'll be fun, and he's in the third book. My name is Gennifer Choldenko, and I'm going to read from No Passengers Beyond This Point. No Passengers Beyond This Point is told in 3 different voices from the 3 different siblings. And this is India, who is the eldest girl. And here we go. What a joke last night was, that stupid family meeting. I mean, my mother landmines our whole life. Then she's like, okay, who wants egg rolls? I wish I had it on video. I'd post it and get 1 million hits. What would I call it? Psycho Mom and the Mushu Pork, Episode 1. She's going to change her mind. Of course she is. We're not leaving tomorrow. Oh, excuse me, today. That just can't be. I can hear Finn moving something heavy out in the hall. This is so crazy. We can't move all our stuff in 24 hours. I get under the covers and pull the pillow over my head. All last night, Mom was like, Colorado is so beautiful. The mountains are incredible. You'll love the outdoorsy lifestyle. She had brochures from the travel agency. We're being kicked out of our house and she's playing tour guide? I wish she'd get a grip. But when I call her on it, she gives me the same stupid old line. When life gives you lemons, make lemonade. What if I don't like lemonade? What if I'd rather drink cyanide? My name is Gennifer Choldenko, and I am reading from Al Capone Shines My Shoes. Chapter 1, The Cream of the Criminal Crop, Monday, August 5th, 1935. Nothing is the way it's supposed to be when you live on an island with 1 billion birds, a ton of bird crap, a few dozen rifles, machine guns, and automatics, and 278 of America's worst criminals. The cream of the criminal crop, as one of our felons likes to say. The convicts on Alcatraz are rotten to the core, crazy in the head, and as slippery as eels in axle grease. And then there's me, Moose Flanagan. I live on Alcatraz along with 24 other kids and 1 more on the way. My father works as a prison guard and an electrician in the cell house up top. I live where most of us civilians do, in 64 building, which is dockside on the east side of Alcatraz, a base hit from the mobster Al Capone. Not many 12-year-old boys can say that. Not many kids can say when their toilet is stopped up they get 7 fingers the axe murderer to help them out either. Even simple things are upside down and backwards here. Take getting my socks washed. Every Wednesday, we put out our dirty laundry in big white bags marked with our name, Flanagan. Every Monday, our clothes come back starched, pressed, folded, and smelling of soap and flour. They look like my mom washed them for me, except she didn't. My laundryman is Alcatraz number 85, Al Capone. He has help, of course. Machine Gun Kelly works right alongside him in the laundry, along with 30 other no-name hitmen, con men, mad dog murderers, and a handful of bank robbers, too. They do a good job washing the clothes for us and most everyone else on the island, but sometimes they do a little extra. The cons don't care for Officer Trixel, so his laundry doesn't return the same way as everyone else's. His shirts are missing buttons, underwear is stiff with starch or dyed pansy pink, pants are missing a cuff, or the fly is sewn shut so the guy can't even take a leak unless he pulls his pants down like a little girl.